I found my 95-year-old grandmother, Rose Martinez, sitting on her front steps at 7 a.m. surrounded by cardboard boxes and a lifetime of memories scattered across her driveway. Sheriff deputies were loading her furniture into a county storage truck while HOA President Derek Coleman stood nearby with an eviction notice and what looked like a satisfied smile. "Abuela, what's happening?" I asked, running from my car to kneel beside the woman who'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. "Mija," she whispered in a frail voice that still carried traces of the strong woman who'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college. "They're making me leave my home. They say I painted it the wrong color and can't pay the fines anymore." I looked at her house, a modest 2-bedroom ranch she'd owned for 43 years, and saw the soft yellow paint she'd applied to the front door last spring. The same cheerful color as the sunflowers in her garden, chosen because it made her smile during the depression that had followed my grandfather's death. "Ma'am," Sheriff Martinez said, approaching with obvious reluctance, "I'm sorry, but the HOA foreclosure sale is complete. Mrs. Martinez has to vacate the property immediately." I stared at the eviction paperwork, showing a debt of $87,000 for accumulated fines, legal fees, and administrative costs that had started with the $50 violation for non-approved exterior paint color. "This can't be legal," I said, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "You can't steal someone's home over paint color." Derek Coleman stepped forward, his voice dripping with the false sympathy of someone who'd orchestrated this exact moment. "Ms. Rodriguez, your grandmother had multiple opportunities to correct the violation and comply with community standards. The foreclosure process followed all legal requirements." As I watched my 95-year-old grandmother, a woman who'd survived the Great Depression, raised 6 children, and worked until she was 87, being evicted from her home over the color of her front door, I realized I was witnessing elder abuse, disguised as HOA enforcement. But Derek had made the most expensive mistake of his administrative career. He thought he was dealing with just another elderly homeowner who'd quietly disappear after losing her home. He had no idea he'd just destroyed the grandmother of a prosecutor who specialized in elder abuse cases and whose entire career had been built on protecting vulnerable seniors from exactly this kind of institutional predation. Derek Coleman was about to learn what happens when you steal a home from someone's beloved grandmother. "My name is Maria Rodriguez, and I need you to understand who my grandmother, Rose Martinez, was before I tell you how I destroyed the man who stole her home and broke her heart." Abuela Rose emigrated from Mexico in 1952 with my grandfather Luis, carrying nothing but hope and determination to build a better life for the family they planned to raise in America. Luis found work in construction while Rose cleaned houses and took in sewing to help make ends meet. They saved every penny for 15 years, living in a tiny apartment and dreaming of homeownership, the American dream that had brought them across the border, with nothing but faith in their own work ethic. In 1967, they bought a small house in Riverside Gardens for $12,000, every dollar they'd saved through 15 years of 60-hour work weeks and careful budgeting. It was a modest 2-bedroom ranch on a quarter-acre lot, but to my grandparents, it represented everything America had promised: security, stability, and a foundation for raising their children. Rose turned that house into a home with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. She planted a garden that became legendary in the neighborhood: tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and the sunflowers that reminded her of the Mexican countryside where she'd grown up. She maintained the house with meticulous care, painting trim every few years and keeping the small lawn perfectly manicured. Most importantly, Rose opened her home to anyone who needed help. During the 1970s, she took in teenage mothers who'd been kicked out by their families. In the 1980s, she housed undocumented immigrants while they found work and saved money for their own places. When I was orphaned at 8 years old after my parents died in a drunk driving accident, Rose took me in without question and raised me like her own daughter. Mija, she'd tell me while we worked in her garden. A house is just wood and paint, but a home is where love lives, where family gathers, and where you make memories that last forever. Rose worked until she was 87 years old, cleaning houses for wealthy families who adored her work ethic and trusted her completely with their homes and children. She saved money religiously, paid her bills the day they arrived, and maintained her house with the pride of someone who'd worked 15 years to afford it. When my grandfather Luis died in 2018 at age 89, Rose went through a period of depression that worried our entire family. She'd been married for 64 years, and living alone felt impossible after sharing every day with her partner in building their American dream. That's when she decided to paint her front door sunflower yellow. Luis loved my sunflowers, she explained while we shopped for paint at Home Depot. Every morning when he had his coffee on the porch, he'd look at my sunflowers and smile. This yellow door will remind me of his smile every time I come home. The paint job was perfect. Rose had been maintaining her house for 50 years and knew exactly how to prepare surfaces and apply paint properly. The soft yellow was beautiful against the beige stucco walls and complemented the garden that had been her pride and joy for decades. For 2 years, Rose's yellow door brought her daily joy during the difficult process of learning to live alone. Neighbors would compliment the cheerful color, and Rose would beam with pride while telling them about Luis and the sunflowers that had inspired her choice. But everything changed when Derek Coleman moved to Riverside Gardens and decided Rose's door was a problem that needed to be solved. Derek was recently divorced, recently retired from some corporate management position, and recently elected HOA president on a platform of upgrading community standards and protecting property values through aggressive enforcement. His first initiative was what he called a comprehensive aesthetic review of all properties to identify violations that previous boards had allegedly ignored. Rose's yellow door was violation number 1. The notice arrived on a Tuesday in March 2023. Exterior paint color not approved by Architectural Review Committee. Correction required within 30 days. Fine, $50. Rose called me immediately, confused and worried. Mija, I don't understand this letter. They want me to change my door color, but I painted it the same yellow as my sunflowers. It's beautiful and well maintained. Why is that wrong? I researched the HOA covenants and found vague language about earth tone, colors, and community harmony, but nothing specific enough to clearly prohibit Rose's soft yellow door. Abuela, I said, let me handle this. I'll talk to the HOA and explain that your door color is perfectly reasonable and has been there for 2 years without complaints. But when I called Derek Coleman to discuss Rose's situation, his response revealed that this wasn't about paint colors. It was about power and control over an elderly woman who couldn't effectively fight back. Ms. Rodriguez, Derek said, your grandmother's door color violates our aesthetic standards. She needs to repaint it in an approved earth tone, or she'll face escalating fines until compliance is achieved. Mr. Coleman, the door is a soft yellow that complements her garden and hasn't bothered anyone for 2 years. Surely we can find a reasonable compromise. There's no compromise on community standards, Derek replied coldly. Rules are rules, and they apply to everyone equally. That phone call taught me that Derek Coleman saw my 95-year-old grandmother not as a longtime community member deserving respect, but as a test case for establishing his authority over residents who might resist his vision of neighborhood uniformity. He was about to learn that targeting vulnerable seniors was both morally wrong and legally dangerous. Derek's campaign against Rose's yellow door escalated with the systematic cruelty of someone who enjoyed wielding power over people who couldn't effectively defend themselves. When Rose didn't repaint her door within the initial 30-day deadline, partly because she didn't understand why it was necessary, and partly because the physical demands of repainting were difficult at her age, the fines began accumulating daily. $50 became $100, then $200. then $500 per week as Derek invoked escalating penalty procedures designed to force quick compliance. But Derek's real strategy was psychological warfare aimed at breaking an elderly woman's spirit through relentless harassment and intimidation. He hired a professional photographer to document Rose's violation from multiple angles, creating a file that treated her sunflower yellow door like evidence of criminal activity. He began driving slowly past Rose's house multiple times per day sometimes, stopping to take additional photos or measurements that served no purpose except intimidating an elderly woman who lived alone. He installed motion-activated cameras on nearby HOA common areas positioned to monitor Rose's front door and document everyone who visited her home. The harassment was working. Rose, who'd been a strong, independent woman all her life, became anxious and withdrawn. She stopped tending her beloved garden because Derek's surveillance made her feel unsafe in her own yard. She began having panic attacks when cars slowed in front of her house, worried that Derek was documenting new violations. "Mija," she told me during one of our weekly dinners, "that man is trying to make me afraid to live in my own home. Every time I look out my window, I worry he's watching, waiting for me to do something wrong. Abuela, what he's doing is harassment. Let me file a complaint with the county." No, Rose said, her voice showing the fatigue of someone who'd been fighting battles her entire life. "I'm too old for more fighting. Maybe I should just change the door color and hope he leaves me alone." But changing the door color wouldn't have satisfied Derek. It would have only proven that intimidating elderly residents was an effective strategy for establishing his authority. His real goal became clear when he began targeting other vulnerable residents in the community. Mrs. Chun, an 82-year-old widow, was fined for having too many decorative flowers in her front yard. Mr. Patel, a 78-year-old recent widower struggling with dementia, was cited for improperly maintained lawn areas because his grass had grown slightly longer during a period when he'd been hospitalized. Derek Coleman wasn't enforcing community standards. He was systematically targeting elderly residents who couldn't effectively challenge his authority, using manufactured violations to establish a reign of fear that would make the entire community afraid to question his decisions. But his campaign against Rose reached a new level of cruelty in the summer of 2023 when she was hospitalized with pneumonia. While Rose spent 2 weeks in the ICU fighting a potentially fatal infection, Derek hired contractors to pressure wash her house and sent her a bill for $800 for emergency maintenance to address health hazards. Rose hadn't requested the pressure washing, and her house hadn't needed it. Derek had simply used her hospitalization as an opportunity to create additional debt while she was unable to resist or advocate for herself. When Rose returned from the hospital, weak, frightened, and facing a stack of accumulated fines and contractor bills totaling over $5,000, Derek made his move for the final solution. He filed a lien against Rose's house for unpaid HOA fees and penalties, beginning the foreclosure process that would allow the HOA to seize her home and sell it to recover the debt Derek had manufactured through his harassment campaign. "Ms. Rodriguez," Derek told me during a phone call where he explained the foreclosure timeline, "your grandmother has had multiple opportunities to comply with community standards. The lien process is designed to protect the association from residents who refuse to follow rules. Mr. Coleman, you fined my 95-year-old grandmother $5,000 for having a yellow door and pressure washing she didn't request while she was in the hospital fighting pneumonia. This isn't rule enforcement. This is elder abuse. Your grandmother's age doesn't exempt her from community obligations," Derek replied with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd planned this conversation. "She can resolve the situation by paying her accumulated fines and bringing her property into compliance." But Rose couldn't pay $5,000 on her fixed income, and Derek knew it. His strategy had always been to create debt she couldn't afford, then use the foreclosure process to steal her home while claiming he was simply enforcing legitimate community standards. The breaking point came in October 2023 when Derek increased the pressure by claiming Rose's garden violated landscaping restrictions because her sunflowers were too tall and created sightline obstructions. Rose's sunflowers had been growing in the same location for 25 years. They were beautiful, well-maintained, and loved by everyone in the neighborhood, who associated them with Rose's warm hospitality and gardening skills. But Derek saw them as another opportunity to increase Rose's debt and psychological pressure. Either the sunflowers come down, or we add landscaping violations to the existing lien, he told Rose during a confrontation in her front yard that I later learned about from concerned neighbors. That night, Rose called me crying, the first time I'd heard her cry since my grandfather's funeral. Mija, he wants to cut down my sunflowers, the ones Luis loved so much, the ones that make me remember happy times when everything else feels so difficult. Abuela, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Derek Coleman is not going to touch your sunflowers, and he's not going to take your house. I promise you that. But privately, I was terrified. Derek had manufactured nearly $8,000 in debt through his harassment campaign, and Colorado's HOA lien laws would allow him to foreclose on Rose's home to collect it. He thought he was dealing with an elderly woman who would quietly accept losing her home rather than fight a complex legal battle she couldn't afford. He had no idea he'd just targeted the grandmother of a prosecutor who'd spent her entire career protecting seniors from exactly this kind of predatory abuse. The morning I found Rose being evicted from her home was the moment this stopped being an HOA dispute and became a criminal elder abuse case with felony implications. Derek had executed the foreclosure while Rose was visiting her sister in California, timing the sale to minimize her ability to seek help or legal intervention. The house she'd owned for 43 years had been sold for exactly enough to cover Derek's manufactured debt, with no surplus returned to Rose despite the property being worth over $300,000. But Derek's timing was his biggest mistake, executing a foreclosure against a 95-year-old woman while she was out of state triggered every elder abuse law in Colorado's criminal code, and I had the expertise to prosecute him personally. My first call was to Adult Protective Services, reporting systematic financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior through manufactured debt and foreclosure fraud. Agent Thompson, I said, I'm reporting what appears to be organized elder abuse by an HOA president who's been targeting elderly residents with manufactured violations designed to create unpayable debt and force home loss. Ms. Rodriguez, if you can document systematic targeting of seniors, this becomes a felony case. Financial exploitation of the elderly is one of our highest priorities. My second call was to the Colorado Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit, which had been created specifically to prosecute institutional predators who targeted seniors. Assistant Attorney General Davis, I said, I need to report systematic elder abuse by an HOA official who's been using manufactured violations to steal elderly residents' homes through fraudulent foreclosure processes. Maria, Davis replied, we'd worked together on previous elder abuse cases. Send me everything you have. If Derek Coleman has been systematically targeting seniors, we're going to prosecute him personally for financial exploitation. But my most important call was to Channel 9's investigative team, whose elder abuse reporting had won national awards for exposing institutional predators. Jake Morrison, I said, I have the story of a lifetime, an HOA president who's been systematically stealing elderly residents' homes through manufactured violations and fraudulent foreclosures. My 95-year-old grandmother just lost her home over a yellow door paint color. The investigation that followed uncovered a pattern of elder abuse that was both broader and more systematic than I'd initially understood. Derek hadn't just targeted Rose. He'd been running a coordinated scheme to force elderly residents out of Riverside Gardens through manufactured violations, unpayable debt, and foreclosure fraud. Over 18 months, Derek had initiated foreclosure proceedings against 7 residents over age 75. In every case, the process had followed the same pattern. Minor violation, escalating fines, manufactured additional debt through unnecessary emergency services, lien filing, and foreclosure sale for exactly the debt amount with no surplus returned to the homeowner. Derek Coleman wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. He was operating an organized crime scheme that specifically targeted vulnerable seniors because they were least likely to have resources to fight back effectively. But his scheme had a fatal flaw. Everything he'd done was documented in HOA records, and elder abuse crimes carried federal penalties that could result in decades in prison. Armed with evidence of systematic elder abuse, I began building the criminal case that would send Derek Coleman to federal prison and establish new protections for seniors in HOA communities. The media attention was immediate and devastating. Channel 9's investigative report, titled HOA President's War Against Seniors, included interviews with all 7 elderly residents Derek had targeted, documentation of his systematic violation of elder protection laws, and footage of Rose being evicted from the home she'd owned for 4 decades. The public response was explosive. Derek's phone number and address were published by senior advocacy groups, and he began receiving thousands of calls from outraged citizens who'd seen footage of a 95-year-old woman losing her home over door paint color. But Derek's response to the media attention revealed that he still didn't understand the scope of his legal exposure. Instead of apologizing and seeking to minimize criminal charges, he held a press conference defending his actions as necessary enforcement of community standards and claiming that age doesn't exempt residents from HOA obligations. Derek Coleman had just confessed on television to systematically targeting elderly residents for financial exploitation, providing prosecutors with exactly the evidence they needed for felony charges. Derek's televised confession to targeting elderly residents triggered a joint federal and state investigation that transformed our local elder abuse case into a landmark prosecution with national implications. The FBI's Elder Fraud Unit opened a federal investigation within 48 hours of Derek's press conference, focusing on his systematic targeting of seniors through what they classified as organized financial exploitation under the Elder Justice Act. Ms. Rodriguez, Special Agent Martinez, told me, Derek Coleman's scheme meets every element of federal elder abuse crimes. We're looking at wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering charges that could result in 25 years in federal prison. But the state charges were equally devastating. Colorado's enhanced penalties for crimes against vulnerable seniors meant that Derek faced mandatory minimum sentences for each elderly victim he targeted. The grand jury indictment was comprehensive: 7 counts of financial exploitation of elderly persons, mail fraud for sending false violation notices, wire fraud for electronic transfers of stolen funds, conspiracy to deprive seniors of property rights, and racketeering for operating an organized crime enterprise. Derek's trial began 6 months later and became a media sensation that drew national attention to HOA abuse against elderly residents. The prosecution's case was devastating in its clarity and documentation. We presented evidence showing Derek's systematic targeting of residents over 75, his pattern of manufacturing violations specifically against seniors, and his use of foreclosure processes to steal elderly residents' homes. But the most powerful testimony came from Derek's elderly victims themselves. Rose, despite her age and the trauma of losing her home, testified with the strength and dignity that had carried her through 95 years of life's challenges. Mr. Coleman made me afraid to live in my own home, she told the jury, her voice steady despite her frail appearance. He watched my house, took pictures of my door, and made me feel like a criminal for painting it the color of my sunflowers. When I was in the hospital fighting for my life, he stole money from me. When I came home, he stole my house. Mrs. Chin testified about losing her home over flower garden violations that had been ignored for 20 years until Derek decided to target her after her husband's death. Mr. Patel, whose dementia made testimony difficult, was represented by his daughter, who described how Derek had exploited her father's cognitive impairment to create unpayable debt through manufactured law violations. One by one, Derek's elderly victims told their stories of systematic harassment, financial exploitation, and home theft that revealed a pattern of elder abuse designed to drive seniors out of their community. Derek's defense strategy was as tone-deaf as his original crimes. His lawyer argued that Derek had been consistently enforcing community standards and that age-based exemptions would undermine HOA authority. They claimed that Derek's actions were legitimate governance rather than criminal exploitation. But Derek's personal testimony was his complete destruction. Under cross-examination, I systematically documented his targeting of elderly residents while ignoring identical violations by younger homeowners. Mr. Coleman, you fined Mrs. Chun for having too many flowers, but you didn't cite any residents under age 60 for identical flower displays, did you? We addressed the most obvious violations first. You initiated foreclosure against 7 residents over age 75, but 0 residents under age 60. Is that a coincidence? We followed standard collection procedures for all unpaid debts. Mr. Coleman, in your interview with Channel 9, you stated that age doesn't exempt residents from HOA obligations, but your enforcement records show you exclusively targeted seniors. How do you explain that? Derek's lawyer tried to object, but the question was based on Derek's own public statements and documented enforcement patterns. I focused on violations that pose the greatest risk to community standards. Are you testifying that elderly residents pose greater risks to community standards than younger residents? That was the moment Derek Coleman sealed his own conviction. His admission that he viewed elderly residents as greater risks justified every element of systematic elder abuse we'd alleged in our charges. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Derek was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison plus restitution of $2.10 million to his elderly victims. The judge's sentencing statement became a landmark in elder abuse law. Mr. Coleman systematically targeted vulnerable seniors for financial exploitation, using his position of authority to steal their homes through manufactured debt and fraudulent foreclosure processes. His crimes represent institutional elder abuse that strikes at the foundation of seniors' right to age safely in their own communities. But the real justice was what happened to Rose and the other elderly victims after Derek's conviction. Derek Coleman's conviction became the foundation for the strongest elder protection legislation in Colorado history and transformed how HOAs nationwide handle elderly residents. The Rose Martinez Elder Protection Act, signed into law 6 months after Derek's sentencing, created criminal penalties for HOA officials who target seniors with discriminatory enforcement and established legal protections for elderly residents facing manufactured debt. More importantly, the settlement fund created from Derek's restitution and the HOA's insurance policies allowed all 7 elderly victims to recover their homes or receive full compensation for their losses. Rose got her house back. The new HOA board, elected after Derek's criminal conviction, made their first official act the return of all foreclosed properties to their elderly owners at no cost. Rose's house was restored to her ownership, and the community established a fund to help with maintenance and repairs she couldn't afford on her fixed income. But the real healing came when Rose repainted her front door. She chose sunflower yellow again, the same cheerful color that had started Derek's harassment campaign and ultimately led to his imprisonment. This time, however, the entire neighborhood celebrated her choice. "Abuela," I said as we stood in her driveway admiring the fresh yellow paint. "Are you sure you want the same color? Nobody would blame you for choosing something different after everything you went through." Rose smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd survived 95 years of life's challenges and emerged stronger. "Mija," Derek Coleman tried to make me ashamed of the color that reminded me of Luis and the sunflowers that made me happy. But I'm not ashamed of things that bring joy. I'm proud of them. She gestured toward her restored garden, where new sunflowers were already sprouting in the same spots where Derek had threatened to cut down the old ones. That man thought he could steal my home and break my spirit by taking away the things I loved. But love is stronger than cruelty, and community is stronger than one bad person who forgot what neighborhoods are supposed to be about. The block party held to celebrate Rose's homecoming was attended by over 200 people, neighbors, family members, prosecutors who'd worked on Derek's case, and senior advocates who'd been inspired by Rose's courage in fighting back against elder abuse. Children played in Rose's restored garden, while adults shared stories about the importance of protecting vulnerable community members from institutional predators like Derek Coleman. Mrs. Chun, who'd also recovered her home, brought tamales made from vegetables grown in the garden that Derek had tried to destroy. Mr. Patel's daughter brought his famous homemade bread, baked in the kitchen of the house. Derek had tried to steal through manufactured lawn violations, but the moment that meant the most to me came when Rose asked if she could speak to the crowd gathered in her front yard. "My friends," she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it since before Derek's harassment campaign began. Derek Coleman thought he could drive me out of my home because I was old and alone and couldn't fight back effectively. She paused to look at her yellow door, gleaming in the afternoon sunshine. But he was wrong about all of those things. I wasn't alone. I had family and community who stood up for me. I wasn't too old to fight. I was old enough to know what's worth fighting for. And he wasn't too powerful to be held accountable. Nobody is too powerful to face consequences when they hurt vulnerable people. The applause was thunderous, but Rose wasn't finished. This yellow door represents something Derek never understood: the right to find joy in small things, to honor the memory of people we've loved, and to make our homes expressions of who we are rather than what other people think we should be. As the sun set over Riverside Gardens, casting golden light across Rose's restored sunflower garden, I thought about the journey from Derek's first violation notice to his federal prison sentence. Derek Coleman had thought he could steal an elderly woman's home over door paint color because she was too vulnerable to fight back effectively. Instead, his elder abuse crimes had resulted in federal prosecution, legislative reform, and legal protections for seniors nationwide. Rose's yellow door, which Derek had seen as a violation of community standards, had become a symbol of the principle that communities are strongest when they protect their most vulnerable members rather than preying on them. Sometimes justice comes through criminal prosecution and federal prison sentences, but sometimes it comes through the simple recognition that elderly residents deserve respect rather than exploitation, that home ownership shouldn't end because of manufactured debt, and that communities are measured by how they treat their seniors rather than how strictly they enforce arbitrary rules. Derek Coleman tried to drive Rose from her home and ended up in federal prison. Rose's yellow door, which started his harassment campaign, became the symbol of elder rights legislation that protected thousands of seniors from similar abuse. That's what happens when you target someone's beloved grandmother. You learn that love, family, and community are stronger than institutional cruelty, and that people who prey on vulnerable seniors face consequences that extend far beyond their small-minded harassment campaigns. Rose Martinez kept her yellow door, her sunflower garden, and her dignity. Derek Coleman lost his freedom, his reputation, and 18 years of his life. Justice has a beautiful color, and it's sunflower yellow.